Hey guys, today I have played against the chessbot SantaBot on chess.com and I have also won. Let me tell you how. I will also show you the game. First, we start with our e4 pawn and then he replies with c5, which is the Sicilian defense. And then we develop as usual. We bring out our knight and then he also bring out his knight. And then we also bring out our knight, and then he brings out the pawn on g6, and then we bring out our bishop, and then he brings out the pawn trying to attack the bishop, and so we take the knight and he also recaptures the bishop as usual, and we also bring out our pawn on d3, and he also brings out his bishop, pinning the knight to the queen, and so we castle, we do not care. And so he brings out the pawn on b5, and we also bring out the pawn on e5, and he brings out his pawn on c4, and we bring out our pawn on h3 trying to attack the bishop, and so the bishop goes back instead of taking the knight, and so we develop as usual, bringing out our bishop on d3 e3, and then they bring out their pawn on b4, and then we take out our knight on e4, and so he takes our knight, and then we recapture his bishop, and then he takes our queen, and then we take his queen with a rook. This is a fair trade, and this also blocks out the king from the d file, and so he brings out his pawn on h5, and we bring out our rook on d4. He brings out his pawn, and we take the pawn on b4, and so if he captures our pawn on b2, we recapture his pawn on b2. He brings out his bishop facing my bishop on e3, and so we move our bishop forward, bringing it to c5, and he brings out his pawn on f6, and so we bring out our rook on b6, and so he brings out his king on f7, and we take the free pawn that was hanging there, and so he also brings out his pawn, but we check the king, and the king cannot take the pawn. Do you know why? Because it is protected by the rook, and so the king moves back. It moves to g7, and we also capture the free pawn, maybe not free, and he recaptures back. And this is also a great move, maybe not a great move, but our best move. Do you know why? Because it blocks out the king from the d file, and we also control the entire file. And so he brings out his knight on f6, and then we bring out our knight on h4, and his rook face challenges our rook, and so we take the rook and he takes our rook on c8, because this is a fair trade. And then we check the king, and the king moves to h7, and then we also capture the piece, and then he brings out his bishop on g5, and then we move our pawn to h4. He captures our free pawn, and we also capture his bishop. He brings out his knight on g4, and we take our bishop on g5, and he captures the piece, and we also check out the king on d7. So the king moves forward. It moves to g8, and so we check the king again, and the king moves to g7. So there is nothing to be done, so we try to promote our pawn, but the center boss sees it and brings out the rook on e2, because this is the best move. Because if we promote our pawn to any piece, he will have to capture the pawn. It is must, because otherwise if he doesn't capture, he will lose the game. So as usual, we take the rook, and he brings out his knight on f6, And do you also see this is a mate in 4? Let me tell you how. Or I will give you some time to think about it. Okay, have you seen? Now let me tell you how. And so we check the king. It is a mate in 3. And so the king moves to f8. And we check the king again by bringing our knight to g6. And then the king moves to g8. And then we capture the free knight. And so it is a mate in 1. Do you know how? I will give you some time. Okay, let me tell you how. And so the final move is rook to g7. And it's checkmate. There you go. Thank you. This is the game between me and the Santa bot. Thank you, stay safe, and Merry Christmas.